to see you. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Deborah Satz, and along with Paul Brest, I'm the instructor for this class. I'm a philosophy professor, and Paul is an emeriti law professor, and this is the second time we are teaching this class. Kesa Goodman serves as our teaching fellow, and this year we've added section leaders for those who've enrolled for an extra unit, and they are Shera Mehta, Sonnet Ju, Brian Monge Serrano, Yayo Avalos, and Garian Nickdow. Kesa has office hours from 2 to 4 on Thursdays, and we have a few slots open for sections, and so if you're interested, you should sign up or contact Kesa. So that's housekeeping. Now let me say something about what the course is about. Deep disagreement pervades U.S. democracy, from arguments about immigration, taxation, foreign policy, reparations, the Mideast crisis, to the function of elite higher education and the value of free speech itself. Such disagreement is not by itself a cause for concern. We should expect that in a democratic society, one not ruled by a king or an autocrat, that is a society based on the equal freedom and status of its members, reasonable people will disagree about many things. Some of the deepest questions of morality, religion, and value are hard to think through. Even people who are well-motivated and conscientious will answer questions pertaining to these matters in different ways, perhaps because of their different life experiences, or because the facts are hard to pin down, or they admit of different interpretations, or because people will make different trade-offs among competing values. Disagreement is a feature of democratic societies and not a bug. But not all disagreements are productive. Sometimes, maybe more than sometimes, people fail to consider inconvenient facts and close their minds to evidence and reasoning that doesn't support their view. Sometimes, and all too frequently in online platforms, a culture of incivility prevails with respect to those with whom we disagree. And note that by incivility, I'm not talking about politeness. I'm talking about the failure to treat other people with respect simply because they hold different views than we do on issues that we care about. The closing of the mind is especially a concern for the university. The fundamental mission of a university is the pursuit of knowledge, and that absolutely depends on the free exchange of ideas and openness to question received opinions. And it is because we feel this mission, the pursuit of knowledge, is under stress from forces both outside and inside the university that Paul and I decided last year to launch this class. Furthermore, we believe that closed minds are not good for democracy, and universities also have a part to play in producing responsible citizens. But you should feel free to disagree with that, I note. As we note on the syllabus, the course is offered in the spirit of the observation by Hannah Gray, former president of the University of Chicago, that education should be intended not to make people comfortable, but to make them think. Each week, scholars who disagree, sometimes quite strongly, about major policy issues will speak. But each scholar is committed to follow the evidence and try to present reasons that others can understand and acknowledge. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes and then join for a conversation on stage, and Paul and I will take turns serving as moderator, and Paul will, in a moment, be introducing today's speakers. We're also going to survey the audience at the beginning and end of the class to see if the arguments that you've heard have changed your views at all. That said, we're not aiming to change your views. We want you instead to get an appreciation of the reasoning behind views, and then whether you change your mind or not, understand better the reasons that somebody might have for taking a different position. We hope that this course engages you in the values of having an open mind, being able to listen to others, and on content, introduces you to facts and values that are important for the issues that we are considering. So please take a moment to use the QR code to confirm your attendance, and then I will, with that, turn this over to Paul, who will introduce the speakers.
Give you a minute more, or a second more, to photograph the QR code. So Deborah has explained why disagreement is essential to the maintenance of democratic institutions, and I just want to supplement her introduction with two quotes, two quotations. The first one is a joint statement by the avowedly conservative Princeton professor Robert George and his avowedly liberal friend Cornel West at Harvard. The two often argue publicly with each other on a variety of issues, but on this one they are in great agreement. They write, "The pursuit of knowledge and the maintenance of a free and democratic society require the cultivation and practice of the virtues of intellectual humility, openness of mind, and above all, the love of truth. That's why all of us should seek respectfully to engage with people who challenge our views. And we should oppose efforts to silence those with whom we disagree, especially on college and university campuses. None of us is infallible, so someone who has not fallen into the idolatry of worshiping his or her own opinions and loving them above the truth will want to listen to people who see things differently in order to learn what considerations, evidence, reasons, arguments led them to a place different from where one happens, at least for now, to find oneself. Our willingness to listen to and respectfully engage those with whom we disagree, especially about matters of profound importance, contributes vitally to the maintenance of milieu in which people feel free to speak their minds, consider unpopular positions, and explore lines of argument that may undercut established ways of thinking. Such an ethos protects us against dogmatism and groupthink, both of which are toxic to the health of academic communities and to the function of democracies." And then just a couple of weeks ago, I came across this opinion piece by an opinion writer in the New York Times. He says, "Whenever someone agrees wholeheartedly with something I write, I die a little inside. I know opinion columnists are supposed to be in the persuasion business, and that makes agreement the coin of the realm. But instant knee-jerk agreements makes me suspicious. That coin is devalued. Yes, I'm happy if you appreciated my columns, but please don't give me an absolutely or nailed it, let alone straight fire. I want to douse straight fires. And please never respond with 100%. I'll take principled dissent, thoughtful counter-argument, and even enthusiastic opposition over 100%. If you react to something I've said or written with 100%, in written, oral, or emoji form, all you're telling me is that I probably didn't persuade you of anything. Instead of changing your thinking, I affirmed it. 100% lets me know that I've accomplished nothing but scratch your ideological itches, confirm your convictions, pinpoint your intellectual erogenous zones. 100%, really? Even if you agreed in the main, did you find nothing at all worthy of disagreement? Not even, say, 3 to 5%? If so, why should I bother writing? Why should you bother reading? 100% agreement is a high percent failure." So one more item. I don't think, by the way, that 100% agreement will be a problem for this course beginning today. So we're going to begin, as Deborah mentioned, we're going to begin each week's conversation with a poll on a relevant question, and then ask the same question after the conversation and the question and answers. What conclusions you draw from the different results, if there is difference, is completely up to you, but if nothing else, it may provide some food for thought after class. So let's put up the question and give you a chance to answer it, and then I will introduce our guests. It's a very subtle and complex question, as you can see. Okay, so the issue of whether reparations should be paid to the descendants of enslaved African Americans has been a topic of debate for many decades, at least since the Black Lives Matter movement, but well before. Proposals to study and indeed enact legislation to pay reparations have been introduced in the U.S. Congress and state and municipal bodies as well. Discussions of the issue have revealed complex political, economic, and moral questions. Without hoping to resolve them today, we're extraordinarily fortunate to have two formidable philosophers and legal theorists who will explore their complexities and provide us with a foundation for further inquiry. Christopher Lewis is an assistant professor at Harvard Law School and our own graduate in law and philosophy, and he writes on his website, "My research uses the tools of analytical, political, and moral philosophy, combined with close attention to the findings of the social sciences, to shed light on normative questions about crime, punishment, and policing, inequality and social policy, education and the family, and race and ethnicity." Daniel Fryer is an assistant professor of law and philosophy by courtesy at the University of Michigan, and he writes, "My work is informed by scholarship in social and political philosophy, law, history, and public policy. I'm also influenced by social movements and intellectual discourse outside the academy. My recent research focuses on assessing how we should construct legal and political institutions to respond to various forms of social and economic inequality, the history of African American political thought, the ethics of punishment, and race theory." And last year, Daniel became a member of the Advisory Council on Reparations for Washtenaw County, where the University of Michigan reside. So each one of them will speak initially for about 10 minutes, and then they will talk to each other. They'll have a conversation with each other, with perhaps Deborah and me interjecting some questions and comments along the way. Thank you both for being here.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and especially excited for sharing the stage with my good friend and colleague, Chris Lewis. We often agree on a lot of things, but when we disagree, it's always quite fun, and I learn a lot from them. So I just thank Paul and Deborah for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody for being here. Before getting into the question that was asked, I feel like I just step back and say what myself and my dear friend Chris Lewis are going to offer are different ways to think about justice. I think at bottom of the disagreement I have with him is just two different approaches to how we think about justice. From my perspective, I just think like justice is a highly historicized concept, and if you don't really know what happened in the past, then it's hard for me to make sense of what we ought to do today. And this sort of approach is just like informs everything I do with respect to my scholarship, but also like when thinking of what is right and wrong in daily life. And I've been thinking this way for a while, but I started thinking about this substantively, and it really hit home one summer after law school, where I was working with the Equal Justice Initiative, which is run by the civil rights and criminal lawyer Brian Stevenson. I was working there, and Brian was telling a story. And the way the story goes is something like this. He goes, well, I was speaking with my friend from Germany, and my friend said something that really resonated. He gets everybody captivated. Like, what was that, Brian? And he's like, well, my friend said, like, in Germany, we cannot have the death penalty. And Brian, like, thinks a little bit like, oh, that's an interesting puzzle. He didn't say that Germany doesn't have the death penalty. He said that Germany cannot have the death penalty. And Brian probes a little bit. He tells the story. He probes a little bit and like, why did you say that Germany cannot have the death penalty? And his interlocutor ultimately says, well, because of the history of genocide, because of the Holocaust that happened in Germany, it would just be like unacceptable for Germany to have a situation in which we are executing people. And you could think further, and it's like, it would be really unacceptable if we had a situation where we executed people and they were disproportionately Jewish. So Brian takes the story, he steps back from the story a bit and say, well, like, this is weird. For his purposes, he's thinking in the U.S. context, and he's like, well, we had a system of slavery where people were deprived freedoms and all sort of freedoms and rights, and now, like, no one really bats an eye at mass incarceration, where the same people who were formerly enslaved are looking like the same people who are now behind bars. And I thought that was insightful, but Brian sort of had that story in a limited context, and I thought a little bit more about that, and I started thinking like, oh, there's a deeper story here, and that deeper story is about how the past influences what is permissible for us to do today. And when I think about reparations, I just think about that, right? I often keep the notion of repair central to what we're doing. That bottom reparation is just about repair. With respect to whether the U.S. should participate in reparation, I think like that's just asking the question of whether the U.S. should sort of participate in some sort of reparative interventions. It's an interesting discussion of what interventions that would entail, but I think like the question of whether the U.S. should participate in reparations seems pretty straightforward if you buy into my idea of justice being historicized. So what do I mean by that? Let me just get this sort of idea going with a couple examples, right? So the basic idea is just like whenever we're determining of what we should do or whether something is just or not, we ought to put the action in a historicized context. So you could think about certain things like tenant farming, for instance, right? So this is a practice that was highly popular in the late 19th century, where the essence of it was like someone would work on a farm and get, not have to pay rent, get basically free housing and some food and maybe a couple dollars in their pocket in exchange for their labor. And I think, like, if you ask me whether that's a fair economic exchange in an ahistorical context, I think, like, sure, like, that seems reasonable. One side is giving up labor and time, and in exchange, they're getting a place to stay and a meal. I think, like, that seems not too problematic. I know there's probably some grad students in the room, and I think, like, that's just grad school, right? We gave up our time and labor for a little bit of money and some food, and that's fine. Like, that doesn't seem too problematic in a historical context, but if you tell me, like, a little bit about history and, like, well, this is coming on the hills of, this is coming during emancipation, and all the people that are actually the tenant farmers are the formerly enslaved, and all the people who are the landowners are the former enslavers, and I think like, okay, well, that's problematic, and now we got reasons to reasonably reject that state of affairs. And I think about this sort of, and I think this sort of way in pretty much nearly every context, right? So if you think about this at the level of principles, right? So take the fair equality of opportunity principle, which some people may be familiar with in the room, but if you don't know the idea, it's like just basically the political philosopher John Rawls' idea that those who are equally talented and motivated should have the same opportunities for the same life chances, mainly thinking about educational opportunities and work opportunities. And I think, like, yes, in a ahistorical society, fair equality of opportunity principle is a perfectly fine principle to guide the sort of opportunities that people ought to have in society. But if you gave me a sort of historical story and I found out that the reason why certain people aren't motivated is because of racial injustice of the past, and I will change my mind, right? So it could be the case, for instance, that the reason why certain black people aren't motivated to become philosophy professors, say, is because they really didn't have any models of philosophy professors in the past, and thus the principle starts looking a little bit more suspect, because there's a sort of valid and problematic reason, there's a problematic reason why certain people don't possess the motivation that we're basically using to determine what life chances they have. And then you could run the same analysis with talent. It could be the case that the way that we construct talent is based on certain racial injustices, just because the people who are in power may be, for instance, looking at the applicants in the same way that they would have viewed their younger self, though they're looking for whether this person has similar traits that they had when they were 18 or 22, et cetera. And I just think, like, okay, once you historicize certain principles, then it becomes problematic, and we ought to consider in the way that history alters those principles. And I also think about, like, if you just think about simple instances of wrongdoing. So take, for instance, there was a situation at Yale a few years ago where a cafeteria worker ended up throwing a brick through a stained glass in a room that was, just as nice as this one. And, like, if you ask me, like, oh, could a worker throw a stained glass through the window of their employer? I think, like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, someone does that should face at least tort liability, if not criminal liability. But if you historicize that and says, well, the worker was a black person who had a stained glass was a depiction of an enslaved person picking cotton. And the reason why he threw the brick through the window was because he didn't want to walk into work every day and see that picture. Then I start thinking about the situation differently. I think, like, okay, certainly criminal prosecution doesn't seem right there, and probably not even, like, that person probably shouldn't face tort liability. And what does that mean? All of this is just to say that history matters when we're determining what's just. So when I talk about reparations, three things that I think it's helpful to bear in mind. So one is just, I think about who ought to pay reparations through an institutional framework, right? So I think that's very important. So the prompt was really about the United States. And I think that's important because reparation claims are normally not directed at individuals, as some people think. It's normally not even directed at racial groups, right? It's not directed at white Americans. It's directed at institutions. So it's directed at governments, both local governments and national governments. It's directed at universities, like the Georgetowns, Harvards, Princetons, et cetera. It's directed at corporations such as Aetna, who made a fortune basically ensuring slave ships and enslaved people. So I think, like, it's very important to think about, when we think about reparations, it's normally through an institutional framework. The second point I want to convey is that compensation isn't really the thing that I have in mind when I think about reparation. I don't think compensation is necessary nor sufficient from a reparative standpoint, right? So the way to see that is just quickly, like, it's not sufficient because we can imagine, Chris turning his back and me grabbing his phone and then running out the door, and then Chris catching me somewhere through outside and saying, hey, Professor Sat said you took my phone, like, could I get it back? And then I give him the phone back begrudgingly, like, here, take it back. At that point, one would imagine that Chris was fully compensated. The thing that he lost before was a phone, and now he has a phone, but there's something deeper that hasn't been repaired, right? Chris will still feel like, you know, this Daniel, you're my good friend, and like I thought we were closer than that, and I trusted you, and et cetera. So there's something about our relationship that wouldn't have been restored or repaired. So reparation certainly, on my view, requires more than compensation. Mere compensation, merely giving him the thing that that was taken is not sufficient. But at the same time, I don't even think compensation is necessary for reparation. And here I often think about the example of the so-called comfort woman, the women who were forced into sexual slavery during World War II. There was an attempt by the Japanese government to pay them reparations, I believe in the 80s, and they rejected it. And they rejected it on two grounds. One ground was just like, look, these sort of donations came from a bunch of sources that aren't the Japanese government, right? It was like through a collection of private donations. So there's always, when thinking about reparation, there's a question of like who could pay these things, like who's in a position to do the right reparative work. But the more robust reason why they rejected it, that's relevant for these purposes, is that they just thought like, well, our primary claim is that we was forced into sexual slavery and treated as prostitutes. So it's not really a sort of solution to say take more money, right? The question isn't so much like whether we received enough money through the process. The question is that the issue is that the process in itself was unjust, and you need to come with more creative ways to think about how to repair the past wrongdoing. So when I think about reparation, this is just to say I don't think this is merely about compensation. Compensation is neither necessary nor sufficient for reparation. And finally, I'll just say, like, thinking through the question of whether the U.S. should participate in reparation, there's a sort of subtle political question that's in there, right? So you could buy into the idea that reparation is old and still think that the U.S. ought not participate in reparations, or you could think like they ought to participate in reparations, but it need not entail some sort of exchange of cash. And there's various questions that are more issued in the political realm than the sort of moral or philosophical realm that we'll probably touch on today. But those are like the three sort of things that I keep in the back of my mind when thinking through this question. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to be back. It's an honor to be on the stage here with my good friend, Professor Fryer. The two of us been following similar paths in life for a really long time, kind of from a distance, and this year we've had the chance to debate this and other topics over a period of time, and it's been incredibly rewarding. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between reparations and racial justice. The prompt or the question was, should the U.S. participate in reparations, particularly reparations to Black Americans for the historical injustice of slavery and maybe for other historical injustices like mid-century redlining, Jim Crow segregation. We can go on and on. What are we talking about when we're talking about reparations? I think we have to be talking about something more than just pure symbolism. Let me tell you why. So where I work, Harvard Law School, there's been a committee for the last, I don't know, a couple years, where people have been debating really intensely about the logo of the school. You've probably seen, the Harvard logo, and the law school is a version of that. It's like this crimson colored shield, and it has some Latin words on it and some symbols. You might not have looked at it too closely. I know I never did growing up in Boston. But apparently, people found out that on the shield was like a piece of wheat or something like that, that was an emblem or a family crest of a slave-owning family that helped endow the school. And the committee said that we should take this off. It's not right for our school, the motto of which is, I think, law and justice or something like that in Latin. We can't have the crest of a slave-owning family on the school logo. So they changed the logo to another crimson-colored shield with some Latin stuff on it, and started printing hoodies and T-shirts and stuff like that, and they sell them in Harvard Square. I've got nothing against that. I don't think anybody should have anything against that. They're right. The logo shouldn't have the crest of a slave-owning family on it. It's hypocritical and ridiculous, and we owe nothing to that family to honor them, given what they've done and what the school stands for. At the same time, this kind of stuff, it doesn't really help people who are struggling, black people in this country who are struggling. If you're a black worker, you come in to Harvard to work in the kitchen or something like that, you take the bus from Roxbury, you're not going to notice that they changed the logo from one maroon crest to another very slightly, subtly different maroon crest. It doesn't change your paycheck. It doesn't change your opportunities in life. It doesn't change the fact that you're working in a kitchen, serving students who don't really even look at you, don't even really acknowledge your labor, the hour-long commute that you took in the morning to get there to serve them this food. So I think when we're talking about reparations, we need to be talking about something material that has an effect on people's life chances, especially people's life chances at the bottom of our social structure. We live in a country where millions of black people are struggling in a public school system where many of the schools are not providing kids with even an adequate or bare minimum opportunity to become full engaged citizens in a democracy, to become educated professional members of the workforce, to succeed in any other way in life. We live in a country where many black neighborhoods are food deserts. It's hard to get an apple. I think we need to talk about these material realities when we're talking about reparations. That doesn't mean that reparations have to take the form of a cash payment, but we are talking about the material distribution of goods and opportunities. And that means when we're talking about reparations, we have to be talking about who should benefit and who should pay. We're talking about distributive justice in a certain sense. And I think that's where I start to get skeptical of the idea of reparations. Let me tell you why. I think if you had asked me this question 5-10 years ago, it would have been a clear yes for me, an easy yes for me. But I've been thinking about this for some time, and I think at this point, my answer would be no to the prompt we were all given. Now, I do think there's a kind of compensation style argument, a good one, for material reparations. I'm actually more optimistic about this kind of an argument, this kind of a theory, than I think Professor Fryer is. I think you can use the kind of reasoning that we use in ordinary interpersonal tort claims, like say you get rear-ended in your car, there's $5,000 of damage. Well, the guy that rear-ended you has to pay for that damage, compensate you for your loss that was due to his negligence. And I think we can use that same kind of reasoning to get a kind of good argument for reparations off the ground, material reparations to black Americans for slavery and other historical injustices. The problem is, I think when you start thinking that way about justice, when you start thinking about distributive justice in a democracy, who should get what and how much, and you start thinking about it like an interpersonal tort claim, what you're tacitly buying into is a kind of right-wing libertarian way of looking at justice. Who owes what to whom, who should get what, who should pay for reparations, and who should benefit, is determined, as Professor Fryer says, by history. It's not determined by what's going on in the present. So if you are a descendant of African American enslaved people in this country, then you are owed reparations regardless of what is happening in the present. And that means regardless of where you are in life. You're owed reparations even if you're a wealthy African American, even if you're Oprah Winfrey, Kanye West, David F. Smith, who I think is the richest African American in this country, businessman. Look at the flip side of that. So if the federal government were to tax people, tax the general public, raise the funds necessary to pay reparations in an amount that would make a difference to the overall landscape of racial equality, we're talking about a lot of money. Oftentimes, proponents of material reparations like to talk about the racial wealth gap in this country. The racial wealth gap, the mean racial wealth gap in this country amounts to around 15 or 16 trillion dollars last time I checked. If we wanted to pay reparations to Black Americans, to put them on equal footing with white Americans, that's what it would take. Now, the odd thing about that is when you actually look at the distribution of wealth among white Americans and Black Americans today, it's highly unequal, right? So if you look at, say, the distribution, the bottom quantile of the distribution of wealth, you're talking about people, white or Black or any other race or ethnicity, who basically have nothing, right? Poor Black people have no assets to speak of, only debt. And the same is true of poor white people. Poor white people have slightly less debt than poor Black people. Now you look at the top of the wealth distribution, the richest white people in the world and in this country, people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, they have net assets around $200 billion each. The richest Black people in this country have net assets around $2 to $5 billion each. So when we're talking about wealth, that's really where the inequality lies. It lies at the top of the distribution, not at the bottom of the distribution. So if we were going to actually if we were going to put Black Americans into a similar situation as white Americans, we would actually have to redistribute from people like Elon Musk to people like Oprah Winfrey, so that Elon and Oprah would each have $100 billion or so in assets, instead of Oprah having only $5 billion and Elon having $200 billion or something like that. And then you'd have to redistribute a little bit from the poor white people to the poor Blacks, so that the poor white people would have a little bit more debt and the poor Black people would have a little bit less debt, but they'd both still be poor. So the basic idea that I want you guys to think about is, if we're talking about distributive justice, who gets what and how much? What are people's opportunities? Why would we think that the way that we should answer that question should depend on what happened to people's families centuries ago? Is that consistent with principles of equal opportunity, or principles, say, utilitarian principles? Maximizing the well-being of everybody? I think probably not. I think if you are a kind of progressive person, if you're on the left, if you're a liberal, it's very difficult to say that, well, your opportunities in life should really depend on who your grandparents were. That's actually the opposite of what most of us say and think. We think your opportunities in life should not depend on what family you were born into. Your opportunities in life, your life chances, should have nothing to do with the family that you were born into. That's actually the whole point of justice. Injustice is the very essence of injustice is the fact that people's life chances depend on what family they were born into. Okay.
This should be fun. Great. So lots to unpack there. Let's start at the top with symbolism, right? So if I understood you correctly, with respect to the ideas of the non-monetary forms of reparation, which, I understand you may not want to call them reparation, but many people do. You look at sort of the reparation councils, including the one that I sit on in Washtenaw County. We're thinking about reparative justice in all these non-monetary ways. They cost money, but nonetheless, they aren't direct cash payments. I'm not sure about you quickly being, you're sort of moved to quickly dismiss that as not really about reparation, if I understood you correctly, right? So your instance was like, yeah, the Harvard sign, not really a thing I would worry about, but that is an issue of reparation, and it specifically affects whether people feel welcome at a particular place, right? It's closely related to the stained glass depicting an enslaved person picking cotton, right? Now I would want to hesitate to make that move from thinking about like this is something that's worth spending my day on to like thinking like this isn't really reparation. But I think like if you have two people, and it goes to the idea of educational opportunity, and while people are getting the same life chances, or whether the life chances are determined through a situation that they haven't, that has nothing to do with who they are as a person, right? So you can imagine two people in this institution, or who are in Princeton or in Harvard, but every day they have to walk past a person who was enslaved, or just which is a reminder of the harmful history. And I just think like, why would I not think that is important? It's affecting whether two people are having a similar experience within an institution, one black, one white, and the only reason that one person is having a harmful experience is because of their race, right? So I think like there's a lot to unpack there with respect to the importance or symbolism. I'm not as quick to dismiss that form of reparation as my good friend Professor Lewis says. And second, on the issue of compensation and whether that is the right framework of thinking about it, right? So Professor Lewis rightly gives nice description of the framework, which a lot of people would be familiar with. It's based on what our tort system mimics, right? If I take Professor Lewis's car and crash it, and then like I could clearly be on the hook to give him a new car, pay for the damages in his car, and the whole purpose of the system is to put him in a situation that he was in before the wrong happened. Now, I don't think that's right with what's happening with reparations in this country, right? I don't think no black American is asking to be put in a situation that we were in before the wrongdoing happened. Instead, black Americans are asking for a level of freedom and equality that has never been experienced in this country, right? So this is why I often am skeptical of the compensation framework, right? It's not really, the request isn't like compensate us to the point where you're putting us in the same situation we were in before the wrongdoing, as it is in the car example. It's actually asking for a new form of freedom that we haven't experienced in this country at all. And finally, I would just say, like, I mean, I don't think the racial wealth gap is quite the right way of forming the baseline for reparations. So I'm not too persuaded by that aspect of my dear friend Chris, Professor Lewis's argument. And in some ways, I wonder, like, even if I was persuaded by it, I'm not sure if that should imply that we shouldn't do anything, right? So even if it is like, look, this is going to be really costly, like there's quite a leap to be like, and therefore we ought not do anything, right? I mean, you could think like there's all sorts of things that can't be fixed, but nonetheless, like if we made the further leap and say we shouldn't do anything about it, then our legal system, for instance, would just fall down, right? Just think like wrongful deaths suits, for instance. It's like, well, no, you can't bring the person back because they were killed either through your product or through your reckless or negligence, and therefore we shouldn't do anything about it. I just think like there has to be some sort of connection that I at least haven't heard, but I look forward to hearing my dear friend make from like, just because something is quite costly, the extra leap is to not do anything about. And there's more about it.
Great, thank you. So on the first issue of symbolism, I don't want to imply that I have anything against taking down Confederate monuments or changing the logo at Harvard or anything like that. I think these are the right thing to do. I just think that can't be the end of the story. That can't be really the focus of the conversation, because that doesn't change the most important aspects of racial injustice in this country, which don't have to do with people on Ivy League campuses. They have to do with people who are living in the worst neighborhoods, who have the worst jobs, who go to the worst schools. And I think that's what we need to focus on when we're talking about racial injustice and when we're talking about justice in general. I think these symbolic gestures are cheap, they're easy, they're the right thing to do, but they just couldn't possibly be the end of the story. So that's all I want to say about that. I have nothing against them whatsoever. Likewise, when you say, this is costly, so should we just not do anything? No, that's not what I would say either. I don't think that, when I look at the state of black poverty in this country, I don't think that, we just shouldn't do anything because the reparations framework doesn't make sense. I think there's a lot that we should do, but what we should do about that isn't really based on a model of reparations. I would say what I'm more in favor of is something like the Nordic model of social democracy, which lifts up people at the bottom of society, regardless of race. Now that would, in this country, disproportionately benefit Black Americans. But the basis for social democratic policy and social programs is not based on looking to the past. It's not based on kind of historical injustice. It's based on looking at the present and the future. And I think that's what we need. I think we need equal opportunity for everybody. I think we need a high floor, a generous welfare state. So I'm coming to this issue from a kind of left social democratic perspective. I definitely wouldn't say we shouldn't do anything, but I think what we should do is more universal social policy that focuses on the least well-off in society, rather than focusing on a racial group where the distribution, not just of wealth, but the distribution of life chances, of opportunities, of education is very unequal, just like any other group. There are Black people in this country that are really struggling. There are Black people in this country who are really thriving, like many of you in this classroom today. If you're here at Stanford, this is an amazing opportunity. It's a rare opportunity. It's an opportunity that most people in this country, regardless of race, ethnicity, or family background, will never get. And many people would kill to have this opportunity. And so I think we need policies, programs, principles, and thinking that focuses on people at the bottom and focuses on society as a whole. I would also say that politically, there's a big advantage to that kind of approach. Now I'm shifting from kind of thinking about what's right and wrong morally to what could actually happen, what's actually feasible politically. And I think when you're talking about social policy that could benefit everybody, or social policy at least that could benefit the overwhelming majority of the citizenry, that's much more feasible than social policy or programs that benefit only, let's say, 10 or 11% of the population.
Thank you. That's helpful. I guess it could be even more helpful to just sort of put on the table and just get the common, at least common understanding of what we mean when we're talking about reparations, right? So when I talk about reparations, I'm typically talking about repairing the effects of past wrongdoing to make people be able to relate to each other as equals in society. And it's a relational repair style argument. And if you're looking at it through that framework, I think like what makes Robert Smith not be able to relate to his billionaire equal counterparts. It's not that like he has 15, whatever the number is, several billion less than Elon. But it's other things in society that has to be fixed. It's the fact that if he's driving his car and the police officer doesn't know who he is, then he's probably going to get pulled over and mistreated. It's the fact that if he has a daughter who becomes pregnant and has to deliver the baby in a public hospital, she's going to be 2.4 times likely to face fetal mortality. It's the and then there's other things like the fact that he probably won't be able to get a taxi if he there's all sort of things in which racism is present in every area of society. And when I think about reparations, it's repairing the effects of that. And so I think like when you start talking about transferring billions of dollars from Elon to Robert Smith, I just think like that's somewhat missing the point of reparations. So I'm just curious, like, what is the point of reparation on your view?
Well, I guess my answer is I'm skeptical of the whole way of thinking about justice. I'm skeptical of thinking about justice as a matter of looking to the past rather than looking at the present and looking at the future. I think when we're talking, I mean, obviously, you're not saying that we should redistribute from Elon to Oprah or something like that. Nobody is really saying that. I point out that possibility just to illustrate the fact that if that's what you would have to do in order to put black people and white people on equal footing in this country. That's what it would mean, because the intra-racial distribution of wealth, opportunity, and education for both black people and white people and every other racial group in this country is highly unequal. And I think we need to pay attention to overall inequality in our society and poverty at the bottom, more so than paying attention to group-based inequality. And this is kind of an illustration of why.
So I have a couple of questions. Imagine, well, there remains a considerable work on providing reparations for objects that were looted by the Nazis, and now trying to restore them to probably the children or grandchildren of the families from whom they were looted. What's the analogy between that kind of reparation and reparations for being enslaved and other ills that have been done over history?
It depends on how far we expand it. Like one potential analogy, it depends on, like, a lot of this just depends on what you think the wrong of slavery was. If you want to focus on the reparation for slavery, if you think like the wrong of slavery was that, and some people think this way, was that Black people didn't get compensated for their labor, then labor becomes the commodity, almost like the thing that was taken from by the Nazis, and that needs to be restored in some way, or the compensation from their labor needs to occur in some way. And I just think but I think that viewpoint of reparation is just the wrong one to have, right? I think the reasons why Black people weren't compensated was because they were deemed not to be persons, and that's a deeper issue that we need to focus on, like how to restore full personhood, especially in the context of these institutions that often tout that they care about equality, whether it's the law and people are deemed to be equal before the law, or whether it's through a lot of universities' missions, which often have some sort of language about equality or equity. And I think that's the focus of reparation in my view. Another analogy may just be there was a family, I believe this came out in the course of the California Task Force reparation report. There was a family who ended up having some land taken away from them, and the land was turned into a park or something. And it's should that family be compensated now for having that land taken in the past, right? So I think things like that often became the case. It's not, when I think about it, it's not so much art or individual artifacts that was taken from Black Americans, like the analogy I think people would either go towards look, it was their labor or it was missed opportunities, like redlining, for instance, right? Arguably there was a opportunity to own a house, and the way that contributes to wealth in this country just magnifies the sort of gap between opportunities that Black and white people have in this country. But I don't know if there's a direct analogy with the artifacts.
I think what I would say is, if we had the opportunity, let's say there were some artifacts taken from a Jewish family that were worth several $1 billion, and we're the German government, and we've recovered these artifacts, and let's say we have two choices now. One choice is that we can return these artifacts to the family that was robbed. The other choice is that we could sell these artifacts and put into place a very robust, a generous welfare state, system of education, and provision of public goods for the least well-off people in society. I would say, as a matter of justice, the second is the right option. And I think if you believe in reparations and kind of historical injustice, you would have to say, no, we should give this back to the family. And I think that's kind of gets at the heart of the disagreement that Professor Fryer and I are having here.
Yes, I think that's mostly true, right? And that's going to capture a lot of the cases. But my position isn't always that you give it back, right? I need to, it's just that you ought to consider it when figuring out what we should do as a matter of social policy, right? Now, in order to know whether it should be given back in that particular example, I need to know more about the society, how pressing are the distributive justice concerns, how pressing are the reparative concerns, but are they old? I think that question would be a yes, and just as a matter of practicality, I would probably be against the people who are descendants of the family who had something taken, receiving an equal amount as everyone else. Even if you had a social policy in which they received the bumped up or something like that, that's what you need to buy into to accept my view.
So I have a question for, well, maybe both of you, but particularly for Professor Fryer, about the role of history in your account. Because there's a problem today in the relations between white and Black people, right? And you point to some of the indices of that. that needs to be addressed. But what is that? I mean, you could say it has a relation to the past, but supposing the past were different, but that was the case today, you would still want to address it. So I'm trying to understand what work the fact of the past is doing, other than supposing the relations today were good. Would the fact that there was an unjust past play any role? And is the work that the past is doing really just undergirding and pointing out something in the present that we, on grounds today, need to address without thinking about what happened before?
Yeah, thanks for that. Good question. So my view is certainly a multi-temporal view. It's not a strictly backwards-looking view, and it could have been suggested that it was in the, based on a conversation that we just had on the basis of the last question, right? So I think, like, no, there's both a backwards-looking element and there's a forward-looking element. And your question, of course, is like, what work is the backwards-looking element doing? And it's essentially constructing what is reasonable for people to reject. So the main loop is that I think the backwards-looking element is determining what one could have reason to reject. So think about it, go back to the Nazi Germany example that I opened up the discussion with, where it's a question of like whether Germany could have the death penalty. If you're looking at that strictly forward-looking from an ahistorical perspective, then there's not much work being done, right? Because I'm thinking about this, again, stepping back at an institutional level and just how we should structure societies. If you're looking at that and just say, like, oh, like, we could look at the problems today and what work is the past doing, I would say, no, because part of reparation has to include, like, some sort of assurance that the wrongdoing would not occur again in the future. And the way that you do that is by setting up certain policies that would preclude the opportunities in which some sort of injustice that resembles the injustice of the past from occurring again. So like if you look, so the short answer to that is like, what work is the past doing? It's constructing our conception of what is permissible for us to do today, right? So, and I think the Nazi Germany case demonstrates that. I think the tenant farming case is meant to demonstrate that. So I can't really know I don't really know. I think the way you structure it was like, you would be concerned about the wrongs even if you had no knowledge of the past or something. And I just think like, no, I don't know if it's wrongs unless I know what happened in the past. Did I misunderstand?
Yeah, so,
Okay.
I mean, of course when I think about the death penalty, I think, oh, we have a lot of history of, mistakes and abuses of the death penalty, and we can draw on that for thinking about whether we should have a death penalty. But that doesn't have anything to do in particular with Germany can draw on the US could draw on Germany. You're making an argument that justice looks different in different places because of the past, and that makes sense that you want the past to do some work. So you have it doing some work by saying you could have a death penalty in the United States or in Denmark, but not in Germany. I want to see what work it's doing here for you in the reparations case, because I haven't yet really heard that.
So part of the reparative project is going to be directed at, say, the criminal legal system, right? So this is just something that pretty much most reparation councils that I know of that are taking up this issue across the country are engaging in, or maybe just housing discrimination. I guess this is a quick way to say it. There's all sort of inequalities that exist in society, right? So my sister, who's about a foot shorter than me, tells me that there's a height wealth gap, right? That is where people who are shorter just make less money. And if you tell me, like, look, there's a height wealth gap in the country, like there's another inequality that someone is facing through no fault on their own, right? They're just happen to be born in a particular way, and like, should we fix that? I feel differently than I do about the race wealth gap, right? I think, like, look, I want to know a little bit about, so if you're persuaded by that, like if you're persuaded by the height wealth gap being less pressing than the race wealth gap, then, you know, you want to know a story, then it's like, tell me the story about like why we should focus on the race wealth gap and not the height wealth gap, and that will be history in my view.
So I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to the class to ask questions. So the one difference between my artifacts rooted from Jewish families is that there's no reason to believe that the grandchildren are any worse off because of the looting that was done to their grandparents. Indeed, probably, if you're going to look at wealth distribution, these are probably wealthy families in Germany or Austria and remain reasonably wealthy families today. Something that differentiates it from reparations for enslavement and you know, bad things done since then is that we believe that some of the harms remain till today. They're manifest today. So one way of thinking about, let me ask the distributive question. You have communities, black communities, in which you predict that the children's futures are going to be bleak, and you can trace some of that back, 100 years, less than 100 years, 200 years. You also have, let's use kind of white Appalachian families, where the children's futures are equally bleak. What do each of you say? Whether you would treat those two communities, those two groups of people differently today?
I would treat them differently only insofar as their present situation and future prospects are different, which oftentimes they are. But I think we can get a clearer handle on this question in a way by looking at the black community, and especially the black community on the East Coast, which is where three of us are from. Professor Satz is from the Bronx, Professor Fryer is from Yonkers, and I'm from a part of Boston called Dorchester that is like the Bronx of Boston. Now, in all of these places, we have black communities, but black communities are very ethnically mixed. These aren't really just African-American communities. The Bronx is full of Dominican people. Where I grew up is full of Dominican people, Puerto Rican people, Haitian people, black Caribbean people from many different nations, living in the same communities, going to the same schools, being harassed by the same cops, really living the same lives. But each of these countries has very different histories. In fact, one of the major ethnic or racial groups in Boston are Cape Verdeans, and Cape Verdeans have an extremely different history than African Americans because they immigrated to Boston, to Dorchester, to my town, to work in the cranberry bogs and to be whalers. So it was voluntary immigration. They didn't come to the U.S. In chains. But their socioeconomic situation today, their prospects, schools they go to, are the same as African Americans. And I think that's really what matters, is that you have a young kid who's Dominican, who's Cape Verdean or Haitian, who does not have a fair shot at life. Their school is crappy, there's too many kids, it's out of control. They're walking around and they're scared because there's so much crime. The crime isn't solved, the cops harass them for stuff that isn't really crime, and they just don't have a fair shot at life. That is really what matters. The fact that these countries have different histories isn't really relevant in these kids' lives, and it shouldn't be really relevant to how we think about what justice requires and what kind of social policy we should have today.
Could you remind me with the two examples? It was both facing a bad situation today, but
of two communities, one white and one black, where the children's future prospects are equally dim?
Right. So in that sort of scenario, so one, I would just want to know, like, what is the reasons why, what are the reasons the prospects are dim, right? If there's any space for the prospects being particularly dim for the black group because of racial wrongs of the past, then that's going to require reparative interventions, right? So, look, when thinking about reparation and whether it's due, this doesn't mean like this is the only element of justice that we ought to care about, right? This should just happen alongside other distributive justice and other forms of justice that we should focus on. And like in that situation, I think like, yeah, there should be all sort of reparative interventions. The point is just to repair the relations that people have within the institutions, and the forms that reparation ought to take will depend. Maybe it should take a form in which it's more class-based, because that's actually going to make people be viewed as equals in society. Like it's a weird, somewhat paradoxical feature of my view is that like if the reparative intervention is going to contribute more to people being viewed as inferior in society, then you ought not do it that way, right? Like, so if it really is the case that some people touted with affirmative action, for instance, it's like, look, this is having a stigmatizing effect on black people, then like that's probably the wrong way to do it. You need to be more creative with the ways in which we advance reparation. But the simple question of like whether you should participate in it, I think like is a straightforward yes for me.
Got it. Thank you both. And now there are microphones on each aisle. And please don't be hesitant. If you're a student in the class or if you're an auditor, don't be hesitant to walk up to the mic and ask questions. So I see Leif got to a mic first, so you go first.
Thanks very much to you both. It's just a terrific debate and a model of civil disagreement. And thanks to the conveners for this opportunity. It's going to be another question for Professor Fryer. Professor Lewis says that his vision of justice is present and forward oriented, and you're saying yours also has a backwards element. And the questions you're getting is how to weigh the backwards component against the present and forward. So here's another way of putting Professor Satz's question. Let's just imagine that a miracle occurs, and we wake up tomorrow. America's perfectly, racially just, distributively just. No wealth gap, no income gap, equal educational opportunities, job opportunities, equal chances of getting pulled over by the cops, maternal mortality rates, chances of getting a taxi. Everything is suddenly and miraculously equal, and it's so equal that we have a confidence it's going to continue to be equal perpetually into the future. So I take it that would satisfy Professor Lewis's ideal of racial equality. Would you disrupt that equality for the sake of your historical element? Would you come in and redistribute anything for the sake of what happened in the past? Thanks.
Good question. So in a nutshell, probably not. But the sort of essential point is like you're positing that things are equal in our present society, and in that sense, justice has already been satisfied. So in that situation, I wouldn't disrupt justice in any way, right? It would, because I don't have a strictly backwards looking view. My view isn't Boxell's, right? It's not a straightforward compensatory approach or a Lockean view. It's not anything like that. But like, will there be a place of reparative justice? Probably, right? Like the institutions ought to be structured in a way to make sure that the past wrongdoing wouldn't occur again, right? So it's not just like disrupting, but it's also putting in place institutional structures and policies and reforms to make sure that the wrongdoing doesn't occur again in the future. So in that sort of situation, I don't think I would be inclined to disrupt it. But my point is that what is going to determine equality in that situation is going to be historically contingent. So that's the essential thing. It's very Millsian in that way.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I appreciated it. My question was for Professor Lewis regarding sort of your idea about distributing the aid equally. Let's say, for example, I think there was an analogy that was brought up with you have a poor white family and a poor black family, and I believe your notion was that we would give aid equally to both as a means to uplift both families theoretically, because no one can decide what ethnicity they're born into. But I sort of had a difficult time reconciling with that perspective, because even though those families may be, they may have equality in terms of their wealth, let's say the black family, they were descendants of, people who were enslaved, who were systemically harmed by the government. Why does the fact that their wealth equals another family that was not systemically harmed by the government invalidate their right to receiving some type of financial compensation for the harm that the government did onto them? Whereas maybe the white family, there was some type of injustice that occurred to them, but it was not systemic in nature. There was some type of bad luck per se. But with this family, they were systemically harmed. So my question is for you: why does that wealth equality invalidate the right to financial compensation? Thank you.
I think it's a matter of what your priorities are. So if your priority is to compensate people to a status quo that might have existed in the absence of certain specific kinds of injustice in the past, then you could think, okay, we really need to prioritize compensating this black family for injustices in the past rather than uplifting a really poor white family who, let's just say, are not, they haven't been the victims of at least the same kind of historical injustice. Yeah, I can see that. I just think that if you accept that perspective, you're tacitly buying into a kind of, and I'm not saying this is the wrong view. That's a more complicated, maybe more fundamental, in a way, bigger debate about justice than what we're having today. But I would say you're kind of tacitly buying into a kind of right-wing political philosophy, like a libertarian political philosophy that's often associated with Robert Nozick. And if you guys haven't read this book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, it's a really great book. It's a fun book. It's a page turner. It's full of really creative, wacky thought experiments that really, really test your intuitions. And it makes a powerful case for a kind of laissez-faire, libertarian, capitalist system where there's a lot of inequality. I think it really brings out intuitions that many of us have that lean that way. Those are not really my principles. So I believe in equal opportunity. I believe in, I'm a kind of egalitarian. And so I think our priority when we're looking at something like this should be really uplifting the poor rather than compensating for the past. And that's especially the case when the two conflict. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you can compensate for the past and uplift the poor at the same time. But sometimes you have to choose. And so that's kind of the example that Professor Brest was bringing out. When there's a conflict between those two, I say, let's focus on uplifting the poor. But again, if you guys haven't read Anarchy, State, and Utopia, I really suggest I think it would be a really important and fun part of a college experience, or even, you know, if you're a law student, a graduate student. It's just a fantastic book to grapple with.
Hi, thank you. Sadly, American history is full of non-hypothetical scenarios. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the site of a notorious and destructive massacre in 1921, you know, many decades after abolition, still, you know, with destruction visited on people who had experienced slavery and who hadn't. This is an instance where victims immediately after the destruction sought tort type of compensation and were denied, and then as recently as just a year ago, were continued to seek reparation and were also denied. So I'm just curious about what that kind of example, how each of you would approach that case with your theory of reparation and history.
That case is an easy one for me. Reparations are due. That case becomes easier in a lot of senses, mainly because there's often criticisms of reparative justice that, look, the people who were affected are no longer here. In that situation, you clearly have the victims of the wrongdoing right there and actually pleading before the courts for some sort of reparation. They did it in the terms of compensation, right? There's a question of whether, like, that's the right route, right? Whether going through the courts for reparations is the right way to do it, or whether we need a broad-scale reparative justice intervention that is happening by legislatures in society. But I think, like, with respect to that case, it's going to be an easy one. That reparation was due on my view. I think, like, again, like, anytime you get a situation in which people are viewed or being treated as inferior, as subhuman, as unequal in society, and that's a product of past wrongdoing, then I think, like, you know, we have to repair it. Like, reparation is just simple. Like, it's not a all-powerful word, right? We should normalize it. Like, at bottom, it's about repair, and that notion of repair is quite important for me. And this is why, like, in the hypothetical that was just posed by Professor Menard, where it's like, oh, but what if we actually woke up tomorrow and everything was fixed? Like, I wouldn't be up here on the stage arguing that the U.S. should participate in reparations in that world, but because that would be a situation in which everything was fixed, right? Reparation is about repair. In order to repair something, something has to be broken. In this current society, there are clearly things that are broken, so reparation becomes an easy question for me. But in that hypothetical society where nothing is broken, then I don't even know, like, as a conceptual matter, whether repair makes sense.
I think it's important to look both at hypothetical scenarios, thought experiments, and also to talk about the real world. I think when we're talking about the real world and you ask a question like that, where you say, you know, should there be reparations for specific horrific injustice like the Tulsa massacre? I want to ask, in the real world, I want to ask, well, how feasible is it to do that? What other things might we be doing with our political energy? If this is going to be a redistributive effort, is this the most optimal way to redistribute? And I think sometimes something that's framed as reparations can be the most optimal redistributive measure, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time what we're going to want to do is focus on the poor and kind of poverty elimination. And I think for political reasons, it's usually better to frame that in kind of in more universal terms, and certainly in race-neutral terms, just to get the thing that actually happened. So I would say, you know, we have to look at what are our options here, what best achieves the goals that we're trying to achieve. And for me, I think again, the most important goals have to do with equality and have to do with uplifting everybody, and especially uplifting the poor. And I think politically, usually it's just an unproductive way to frame things. Even if you think, well, that's the moral reason why I want to uplift poor people in Tulsa or something like that, because it had this history where there's a race massacre. You might not want to say it that way in order to get it to actually happen, given the politics in Tulsa or in Oklahoma today in the real world.
Chris, I want to understand. So if Jeff Bezos was robbed,
Yeah.
would you be opposed to returning his funds, which was suggested? I mean, the case of the Holocaust property, at least you could say it's not the same people, and there's a special, but now Jeff Bezos is robbed. You could return the money to him, or you could redistribute it. And sometimes it sounds like you're saying there's no role here at all for like rule of law and.
Well, that's a funny question to ask a law professor, and maybe this reveals sort of where my true heart lies, more with the moral philosophy than with the law. But look, do I have the option to give the money to homeless people on the street? Because if I do, I'll rob Jeff Bezos myself, and that's just kind of my priority. That's the. Don't worry, Jeff, I'll leave you alone. But yeah, that's kind of where my moral principles take me. I'm not someone that thinks property rights are sacrosanct. I think if you do believe that, then that is a kind of right-wing libertarianism. That's kind of what Robert Nozick would have believed. Robert Nozick certainly would have given the money back to Jeff Bezos and think that that's the right thing to do. I think if we've got the option to redistribute it, then that's the right thing to do. That's what justice requires. That's kind of, yeah.
It's not just Robert Nozick. Our whole legal system is contingent on like him being able to get his money back. But
thank you very much to both of you for your thoughtful dialogue. This is a question for Mr. Fryer. You make a strong case for the existence of racial disparities that exist beyond economic disparities. However, if things like money or land are not as relevant as something to give back, as you argue in a more non-compensation-based reparation, how do you distinguish between your definition of reparations and just racial justice more broadly?
Oh, good question. So I should clarify, it's not that I don't think money is important. I do think money is important, especially as a contingent matter. I just don't really vision a reparative justice program, a successful reparative justice program in this country without money being involved. When I was making that point, I was just sort of highlighting that, and I guess I was in some ways encouraged by the prompt. I was just highlighting, like, you could agree that the U.S. should participate in reparation, even if you don't buy into the compensation aspect of it. I just happen to buy into the compensation aspect of it, and I think like that's going to be part of the solution. But it comes down to what's our aim, right? So you could think like, look, is the aim to compensate black people for historical wrongdoing, or is the aim to restore or repair their unequal relationship that black people have with the relevant institutions in this country? And I happen to think the latter. Now, in order to do that relational repair work, you're gonna probably have to compensate, but that's not the aim for me, right? Like this thing like the compensation is just at best a means to an end. Now, there's an even deeper question that's hidden. It's like, well, what's the relationship between that and racial justice? I think, racial justice has both backwards and forward-looking elements. There's also the things that may have nothing to do with the past that we may want to buy into for racial justice. It's hard to think about this because, again, as a historical matter, I often think about these historically. In some ways, I think like this is often the source of a lot of disputes between myself and my dear friend Chris Lewis. Is that like you know, we're both legal philosophers. We both are from these cities on the East Coast, but I like lean towards history a lot, and he leaned towards some of the social sciences a bit more than I do. But I think, like to answer the question, I think racial justice also has forward-looking elements. So anti-discrimination law, for instance, could totally be viewed as an element of racial justice, but that has arguably not much to do with reparations if you're thinking about it in a more limited way. So I think, in a nutshell, like racial justice is an umbrella term, and reparation is just going to be one element under the subset of one element that's a subset of racial justice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is also a question for Professor Fryer. It seems to me that if we lean on history to try to resolve the issues of justice that we see in the present day, we kind of inevitably run into the problem of intersectionality. So it's certainly the case that there has been so much injustice as a result of race, but also injustice have arisen because of geographic location, religion, and perhaps most pervasively, gender. How do we do a justice calculus based on all these factors? And also, how do we determine who should pay the reparations and who should receive the reparations? Because it seems that everyone, in some manner, seems to be both a person who has incurred injustice, and also one who has also incurred injustice on others.
Thanks. Big questions. I'm going to be super brief, not because I don't recognize the force of the question, but just on the basis of time. So, in terms of like who pays, I sort of already put my cards out there. Like mine is an institutional framework, right? It's not so much looking at individuals to pay it, but those who make the relevant decisions within the institutions, right? It's going to be like the lawmakers if we're talking about governments. If we're thinking about an institutional framework like the university, in some ways all of us are going to pay, right? So because if like a consequence of it is like increased tuition, then like various people are going to pay in some sense of the term, but like at bottom, it's going to be an institutional payer, right? And then the beneficiaries is going to be contingent on what we are trying to repair, right? So if you're looking at some things, it's going to like, the question is just not going to need to be resolved. Like if we're looking at whether to get rid of a logo or whether to get rid of a statue, it's like, who's the beneficiaries? Well, I think all of us are going to benefit from living or working or going to an institution where we don't have the horrible reminders of Black people being deemed as inferior for generations. So there's going to be that aspect of it in terms of like who pays and who receives the benefits. I don't have this sort of view of reparation being limited to American descendants of slavery. We didn't get into that, but my view isn't a sort of ADOS view, so I could just like unsatisfactorily posit that. And like at bottom, like the picture I have is somewhat like an altered, and this gets to the intersectional question, it's an altered Rawlsian picture, right? And it's like just the historicized initial situation where the Ville, I don't even know how much this class knows about this. Sorry, I don't understand there's undergraduates in it. But it's just like, you know, Rawls has this idea of like, picture yourself behind a veil of ignorance, and you don't know your place in society. You don't know the history of society. And when the veil is lifted, you could find yourself in a position of anyone. What sort of institutional framework would you adopt, right? And like, again, I'm sketching. This is a completely unsatisfactory sketch. And I think, like, look, the only modification I would want to make to that is actually you should know the history. So you know that when the veil is lifted, you could be a black lesbian woman from Tulsa, right? So this is the intersectional picture. And then it's like, what would you agree to, right? So is the view I have on, the view that I have is one that I think can accommodate intersectionality, right? So just imagine yourself like, if you're in that situation where the veil is over you and you don't know if it's lifted, like who you're going to be in society, like what sort of policies would you advocate for? Like, would you agree to that the U.S. should participate in reparation, regardless of like how they look? Like the simple question of whether you would agree that it participate in reparation, I think that should be a yes, and I think the view accommodates intersectionality in that way.
We have 3 questioners left. Why don't we begin with you and then go to the other side?
Yeah, thank you. This has been extremely instructive. I'm wondering about the sort of the role of national versus international history, right? Slavery is a product of colonialism and imperialism. And so as, policymakers, and I'm understanding the sort of the audience, the subject to be policymakers here in both of your arguments, how much attention should be paid to sort of national reparations for those who were ultimately brought here and brought up in this racialized class system versus other countries, and this comes up also in sort of climate and other areas that kind of intersect with class and race and colonialism, focus on the harms that were wrought in the places that these folks came from originally. Is there something that is specific about a government's duty to the people within its national borders, and or how does a reparations framework expand to consider the larger colonial history?
Okay, so in my way of thinking, there isn't really a relevant difference between historical injustices that happened in the US and historical injustices that happened somewhere else. So if I'm looking at children in the black community on the East Coast, and some of them are African American, some of them are Haitian American, whose families, whose ancestors were victims of historical injustice in the US in one case and in Haiti in another, I don't think that one family is entitled to something that the other family isn't entitled to. I actually think that's quite an odd way to think about justice. But I think, I worry that if you think about justice historically, it's hard to avoid that way of thinking because, we're talking about the US government. The US government isn't really responsible for all the things that the French government did in the 17th century. So why should the US government repair the injustices of the French government in Haiti and in the 18th century or something like that?
So I guess, sorry, to clarify my question, is there a duty of repair that the US government owes the either the government or the people of places where slaves were brought from? So, there's a family here who has this kind of, racial legacy in the US. Is someone whose family member was taken away and or, communities disrupted and in an ongoing way, right? Colonialism, imperialism are not things of the past. Are they owed anything under this framework?
I'm really not sure. Do you want to take a step?
I would say, well, I don't know about that circumstance. I thought you were going in another direction when you started talking about colonialism. So I think like the claim could just be made by former colonies of certain nations against their colonizing forces, right? So whether like some of the French colonies or British colonies, and those nations now have a claim for reparation against their former colonizers, right? Algeria against France, et cetera. And I think like, yeah, like from a moral perspective, that seems like something that should be considered. There's principles of international law that precludes this, right? There's like a well-known principle in international law that says something along the lines. Again, I'm just sketching this because of the time, but it says something along the lines of in order to receive reparation, the thing had to be wronged at the time in which it occurred, right? So has to be a law within place within the nation in which when this occurred, it's not just that everyone understood it was morally wrong, but that it was actually legally wrong. And I think that becomes a barrier for people receiving reparation in the international realm. But the bottom line is, like, I think all all sort of institutions ought to consider like ways they could repair the wrongdoing of the past. And you said at the beginning, like, it's very much that it has to be like lawmakers. I don't think that's true, right? Remember, mine is an institutional focus. I think like it depends on what institution we're looking at. I think a lot of like the people within the institution are going to be the best, and sometimes are going to be the best people to think about how to do that, right? Like, so I think banks, universities, like I'm not totally sure if I think like the lawmakers ought to be directing the universities of the right way to repair, but possibly giving some guidance is relevant. But at bottom, I just think like it depends on who the institutional players. All institutions should just be looking at ways of repairing the wrongs of the past, and that could happen both at a local level, such as like Washtenaw County, which is the Reparation Council that I am involved with. It could happen at a university level. It could happen at a national level, and I don't know if we have the infrastructure in place for international law, but it seems like it should be appropriate there too.
So that we have time to do the poll as well, why don't we take the two questions? Why don't each of you pose your questions, and we'll do a lightning round of answers and then do the poll.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And yeah, I'm really glad I stumbled upon this class, especially as an international student. I'll recommend that becomes shared with all of international students trying to figure out America. The thing that got me out of my chair was this. It really bothered me in a way during the whole talk how the question that was posed was about institutions and the US as an institution. And then usually when we talk about reparations, it's at the level of be it local or country-wise government. And then a good bunch of the examples that both of you kept on giving was at an individual level, like stealing a phone, bumping a car, whatever it may be. And from their nature, of course, individuals and institutions are vastly different, and individual memory and institutional memory are as well vastly different things. So my question is maybe challenges a bit more Professor Fryer's point, but it's to the both of you in terms of how you frame your thought. When we speak at an institutional level, this idea that history should inform the reparations that happen now and whether they should happen at all, what is this institutional memory that is guiding this? And particularly the point I want to make is, say, if the US had at some point between the Civil War and now ceased to exist as a country, and a new country was reestablished that was called something else, would that country then also make reparations just because it happened to be in the same geographic location or because it happened to be the descendants of the same people? And that also relates to the previous question of like, if the wrongdoings happen elsewhere in another geographic locations to the same people or descendants of those people, is another institution, why is there a notion of like someone owes someone something and someone should be doing something just because there's some memory somewhere in the air, and who decides why this should be happening, in what sense? Yeah.
So before you answer that question, let's get your question out too.
I had two things. One was sort of similar to what you just said, that the hope, where I think for me the hope of these kinds of discussions is for it to be feasibly implemented at some point, hopefully in the near future. That's like the point of discussing these things. But when we're talking about institutions being the ones that are bearing the cost of the reparations, in the US, when I think institution, I'm thinking the US government paying back the African Americans who had ancestors that were enslaved. However, as it exists now, middle income individuals, as well as ones peripherally, are bearing the brunt of such taxes, and it seems to be, that seems to mean that this cost is just being, when we're using the term an institution is gonna take on this cost, that it's just becoming a little bit less personal, and the cost is being spread out among a lot of different people that perhaps may or may not have had a hand in what has been done. So I guess this question is more so to Professor Fryer. And then separately,
I think we better stop with one question because we only have a few minutes left.
Okay, just being. Okay, just being super brief, I'm sorry, this is going to be unsatisfactory, but I will just note that some people don't think taxes is the correct way to generate the money from the U.S. government. I think William Darity, who has the most well-known book on reparation in the last few years, thinks no, the U.S. could just print money, and then there's arguably some sort of inflation, and how would that affect society, and arguably it could fall disproportionately on the middle class. They think not, and there's complicated questions of where it's going to come from if you're thinking financial compensation at the U.S. level. But again, my picture isn't just going to be on the U.S. level. It's going to also be local institutions and local governments and institutions that aren't governments. And yeah, this is the good point, right? And I struggle with, part of that is methodology. So the point was just look, you're focused on institution, but a lot of the pumping goes towards individual cases. And I think that's just somewhat a flaw of philosophical analysis a lot of the time. The way to really get people to see the case a lot is often oh, look what happened at the interpersonal level. But that may be some things that we miss through the process. One of the things that I would want to highlight with respect to institutions, it seems to be the case, it is the case that institutions receive various benefits from being around a long time, right? Whether it's the trust that people have in financial institutions, the avoidance of intergenerational wealth transfers, et cetera. And it's so you can imagine just look, if you're receiving the benefits of that long-term existence, then perhaps you also receive the burdens. And finally, just the idea of what was it? It was the main point. It was.
Had the U.S. ceased to
the counterfactual reality. It was interesting because Frederick Douglass kind of wanted something like this. He wanted, he thought we needed to get rid of the U.S. Constitution and just create this system anew, right? So he thought no, we need to create a new country. That's the only way to do things, as opposed to just amending the Constitution with the Reconstruction Amendments. But at bottom, that question is just a question of what would it take for something to be considered the same. I don't think merely changing the name of the institution would have been satisfactory. I think arguably a new constitution, new political structure, other things happening. It's a really complicated question, but I certainly don't think we would need to get rid of everything in order to be considered new. And it's a weird thing, and I'll just end with this. It's weird because there's often this sort of conflicting things that they're pulled towards, right? When it comes to reparation, there's often a lot of people that have a conservative view are look, we don't really want to look back at the past and determine look at those things to shape the way we do things today, but then they advance originalism, which is strictly based on the idea of the U.S. still being that same government that we were over 250 years ago. And I think I have that same intuition of like originalists, and I think like we are the same institution in various ways, and the U.S. have benefited from being the same institution in various ways.
While Professor Lewis answers the question, please be sure to answer the poll, and then as soon as we're done with that, we will look at the poll results, and then I will thank our guests.
So I would say, regardless of whether reparations were funded theoretically through taxation or printing money, this does raise the question of who is going to pay and who is going to benefit. These are questions of distributive justice. Sometimes we like to answer these questions using thought experiments, hypotheticals at the individual level, where we're talking about something like a car getting bumped or a wallet getting stolen. One of the things that I'm worried about is that that kind of individualistic way of thinking about political philosophy and thinking about justice on a societal level actually leads us down a road that many of us who see ourselves as progressives, liberals, egalitarians, don't really want to go to. But here in America, we're very tempted by kind of libertarian thinking. And that's kind of individualistic, moral thinking like that, rather than thinking at a societal, truly institutional level. So I would just end by saying, look, if you're in college and you haven't done this yet, I think it's a really good time to think about what your principles of justice, your principles of morality really are. We don't ever really get another chance to do this. This is your time to do it. We just kind of do what our parents are telling us to do or what our peers are doing when we're in high school. But when you're in college, you get to rethink, is that really the way you want to live? Is that really the way you think society ought to be? Here we have a class that I TA'd several times as a grad student that's just called Justice. It's a fantastic class. I encourage you to take it or take a class on ethics or just pick up some books on moral and political theory because it's a really great time to do it. It's a great way to expand your mind, to sharpen your reasoning, and to think about the kind of person that you want to be.
So let's put up the poll results. I don't recall what it was at the beginning. Has it moved?
Yeah, it's more,
Quite a bit.
it's more negative.
So while we admire the poll results, let me just say that this could not have been a better way of beginning our course. You dealt with incredibly complex issues in a clear and nuanced way. If the next 9 classes live up to this standard, we'll be very happy. So thank you.
Thank you.